Good to see you, Minister, and wishing you well in the upcoming Shuffle sweepstakes. You mentioned at the beginning a grading system, and I want to ask, if you were to give a letter grade to the effectiveness and integrity of the procurement system over the last 9 years, what letter grade would you give?
Well, thank you, MP Generous. We see each other in many circumstances over the last week. I appreciate the fact that you're asking good questions on procurement and implicitly recognizing that
I'll appreciate when you answer them.
Yes, I'm coming to that, obviously.
I doubt it. Go ahead.
The fact that you're asking those questions about integrity also suggests that you value.
Sir, just give me a letter grade, though. Like it's not a difficult question. I'll get to the difficult ones later. But how would you rate your performance, the performance of the government's procurement department over the last 9 years? Just give me a letter grade.
Well, in the last 9 years, I can speak, obviously, to the number of thousands of lives that were saved during COVID-19 because of vaccine.
I'll give you 10 seconds to give me a letter grade. Go ahead.
So, yes, you can also speak about the national shipbuilding strategy, which is sustaining the jobs of about 20,000 workers every year.
Okay, time's up. Honestly, if I were the minister and I had your record, I would not want to give a letter grade either. Minister, if a third-party auditor flags that there's fraud on a particular procurement file and recommends that it be referred to the RCMP, what should the government do in that case? Another fairly easy question, I think.
What it should do is that exactly what you're probably also thinking is that it should take those allegations very seriously and expect and demand that public service, independently of political interference, do the job that they need to do.
And what is that job? If an independent auditor says there's fraud, we think it should be referred to the RCMP, the public service should then refer it to the RCMP, right?
Yeah, well, the public service
should they?
is a big, not every.
Sir, we're still on the easy stuff. If a third-party auditor says that hypothetically a procurement file involving the Canadian Healthcare Agency involved fraud, and that third-party auditor says it in a meeting with multiple public servants from multiple departments, saying we think it involves fraud, we think it should be referred to the RCMP. Should they take it seriously and refer it to the RCMP, or should they take it seriously and try to bury it? What would you suggest?
Well, you spoke about hypothetical, and hypothetical cases are not truly useful cases to discuss in such general terms. I think you need to be more specific as to what exactly you have in mind.
Okay, I have in mind the case this committee heard about this week from Gary Hartle, who was an independent auditor who brought a room full of public servants evidence of Indigenous identity fraud on the government years ago, and recommended that the case be referred to the RCMP. The government decided, in his words, they didn't want any trouble and decided to bury it instead of referring it to the RCMP. Do you think that was a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, MP Generous, this is a great question, which I heard you ask.
And I look forward to a great answer.
Exactly just a few days ago to Minister Aidu, and she provided all the answers that you were correctly expecting of her, because it's in her file, it's her department. You know that because you asked her directly those same questions.
PSPC officials were in the room, sir. Your officials were in the room. I think at a basic level in terms of setting the tone, now would be a good time for you to advise your officials and the public that when they become aware of instances of fraud, they should refer that fraud to the RCMP. And you seem unwilling to say that.
Je peux le dire en français si en anglais ça fonctionne moins bien. Mais
I can say it in French if it's not working into English. We had a meeting where you were present, Mr. Jean-Yves, with Minister Aidu, and you asked exactly the same question, and she provided you with the proper responses. So if you want to have a conversation with Ms. Ailu, you can do that, but you had that conversation a few months ago.
I welcome you. Neither. C'est une question très simple. Si c'est une...
It's a really simple question. So if it's a case of fraud,
and since your officials were in the room, should they have given that information to the RCMP or buried it? And I wonder, frankly, how many other cases are there? But can you just clearly tell your officials and the public that instances of fraud, when officials become aware of them, should be referred to the RCMP? Yes or no?
J'ai répondu à cette question à plusieurs reprises.
I've already addressed the question on several occasions, Mr. Alois, and Ms. Naidu addressed the question on several occasions as well. The same question a few days ago. I think maybe you just have to return and see what her response was, and it'll be easy to understand.
Even give a simple yes to a very simple question. That's
Thank you.
Truly unbelievable.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Here today. After 9 years of this Liberal government, everything is broken. And you don't need to take my word for it. And I'm going to note that it's especially the procurement system within the Government of Canada. This is not a partisan statement, but a sentiment that is also shared by the Procurement Ombudsman. In an article from Blacklock's reporter titled $25 billion Contract System Broken, the Procurement Ombuds said that the Canadian system is kind of near the bottom tier, and that's a quote. He went on to say that the irregularities, such as the sweetheart deals, are symptomatic of a broken system. And on Tuesday, when he appeared before committee, he gave us some examples, such as, and it was quite a list, such as We Charity, ArriveCan, McKinsey, Bait and Switch, and now Indigenous procurement. And as you said in your opening comments, Minister Duclos, Public Services and Procurement Canada works with all departments when it comes to procurement. So billions of dollars are being wasted and going to Liberal insiders who are basically fleecing taxpayers. How much money are taxpayers on the hook for outsourcing this year? Can you provide us with a number?
Well, I'm very glad that we're talking about procurement this morning, because procurement in the federal government represents approximately 400,000 contracts and other activities that, in fact, just dating back 2 years ago, have saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of Canadians because of the immense ability to save, the issues that we were obviously facing in hospitals and across Canada, vaccines and PPEs and other things, and pointing to the successes and the challenges, which you're correctly pointing to, that we're having with the national shipbuilding strategy, defense procurement.
Excuse me, Minister, I didn't point anything out about the national shipbuilding strategy. I asked how many contracts are being outsourced and how much are Canadians paying for those contracts to external consultants.
And I'll come back to that in a moment.
I would actually like you to just provide me with the answer now.
Well, we have, I'll come back to what I thought would be my first point. I'll come back to that second. But on external services procurement, as you will know, we have significantly reduced those dollars, because we don't need those investments so much as we did need them during COVID, where the lives and the safety of Canadians were extremely important to the federal government.
By how much have you decreased the amount of funding being spent on external contractors?
So by approximately 15%, because that's the right thing to do.
15%. What is the dollar amount?
I know translation may have a difficulty if we interact too often together. It will be difficult for French-speaking MPs and others listening in the room and outside to follow.
I'm going to interrupt here, and I've stopped your clock. This has come up before repeatedly. If there's issues with the interpreters, they will advise the clerk, and the clerk and I will intervene. Until then, we'll get back, but we appreciate if you could respond to the question. Thank you.
So should I... So as I mentioned, it's about 15%.
An amount in dollars, please.
Well, it depends on departments, because we don't control all contracts, but each department has had the objective overall of decreasing reliance on external consultants by about 15%.
So in other words, you don't know the number. We know that the government has blown past its deficit targets. How much of that is due to the increase in outsourcing?
Well, that's a great point that you're making, because we are seeing in Canada a fall in inflation, a fall in interest rates, just announced just a few days ago, the 5th in a row, which is the fastest fall in interest rates seen across all comparable developed economies. We're also seeing an increase in employment.
Minister, I know we've had this kind of an exchange in previous committees, and I can appreciate that you really don't want to answer the questions that we're asking here today. But you're really doing us as parliamentarians and Canadians a disservice when you ignore the questions that we're asking on behalf of Canadians. And so I would simply put to you, your government is blowing past its deficit targets. How much of that is due to an increase in outsourcing?
Well, what I'm trying to do, respectfully, is to support the initial part of your question, which started by saying that everything is broken in Canada, which is inaccurate and I think insulting to most Canadians because, as I said, we are doing really, really good compared to most other countries in the world. Yes, we've had challenges post-pandemic.
In other words, you would say that Canadians have never had it so good. Is that what you're saying?
Canadians don't want to hear that everything is broken, as some people indeed are saying in the House of Commons and elsewhere. That would be inaccurate. And again, it would be insulting to most Canadians to pretend that everything is broken.
So let's get back to what the Procurement Ombudsman said. Do you agree with the Procurement Ombudsman when he talks about the procurement system being broken?
I can turn to official, but I would be surprised if the Procurement Ombudsman had said, like you did, that everything is broken in Canada.
He said, and I quoted it for you, sir, that the Canadian system is kind of near the bottom tier, and he said that the contract system is broken.
I have to interrupt. That is our time. We'll go to Mr. Kusmirchuk. Perhaps you can address it during that time period. Go ahead, Mr. Oh, Mrs. Kusi.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et bienvenue, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to the Minister for appearing. This is our committee. Thank you for appearing this committee this morning.
Found committing fraud against the government. Last time you were here in November, the number was 7. How many is that number at today, please?
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question. I am happy that we can talk about the procurement system because this plays a key role for Canada, workers and businesses, and it's really key for government and Canadians. And for such a system, I'm waiting for the number from you. You're the minister, so in my view, you should be able to tell us how much. And yes, you're entitled to knowing the exact numbers and the up-to-date figures. Quickly, because I have many questions.
The respect we're supposed to afford other members of our House, including ministers, and so I would just remind us.
I appreciate that.
Yell.
Respect goes both ways. There was a very clear question. I think taxpayers and MPs deserve a very clear answer.
Point of order.
Continue. Go ahead.
It's more about the yelling at the minister than the question. Thank you.
I'm sure Mrs. Kusi will take that under advisement, but continue, Mrs. Kusi.
Yeah, it is a very clear question, Minister. How many cases of fraud? Please tell Canadians. Just the number. Do you know the number?
Et si je comprends bien votre question, la réponse.
If I understand your question, yes, I already asked you in English and in French. What is the number, please? The answer is 7 cases, 3 that were announced last spring, 1 that added in July, and 3 others over the past weeks.
Comme vous le suggérez.
Civil servants, as you suggested, and as is important, are continuing to do their work on integrity. It's much easier now with the electronic procurement system and with information sharing. Thank you. And what's the value of these 7 contracts, these fraudulent contracts? What's the amount, the dollar amount? For the specific amount, Deputy Minister, do you have the number?
Would you?
Donc, on pourrait vous attendre.
Every effort that needs to be put into this is being put into this. Obviously, this is a politically independent process. We wouldn't want politicians, whoever they may be, to undermine the ability of the independent public service officers to do that job. So it's not a matter of how many I think there should be.
Okay,
It's
so
how
you've
many the
said
public
that you
service-
don't want to undermine public service officers doing their job. Then, in your opinion, please, Minister, do you believe all of the scandals, including the billions lost to CEBA, which we just found out about last week through the Auditor General, as well as the millions spent on ArriveCan, as well as McKinsey, that the procurement officials then you're saying are the ones who Canadians are to blame for this large number, this millions of dollars, which I believe it's actually significantly more than that. But what do you believe it's your officials to blame then, Minister?
You're asking whether we should be blaming officials for
I'm
not-
asking you what you think, why it's currently $4.5 million for 7 contracts. What do you think? Why do you think? And I think the number is way more than that, and we've seen these numbers increase consistently, whether we're talking contracts, fraud, the debt, the deficit. But in this case, the fraudulent contracts of 7, why do you think that's occurring, please?
So, as you're correctly suggesting, officials have the obligation to do whatever they can in an independent manner, not focus on politics and politicians, to do whatever they need to do to find out instances of fraud, and if there are such instances of fraud, to do whatever they need to do, including with the RCMP and other law enforcing institutions, to collect and recollect the amount that would have been paid inappropriately.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned politicians. Minister, I just wanted your ideas as to what you believe your leader, the Prime Minister, is doing to the Finance Minister. We've seen 2 days of leaks in the Globe and Mail, and we know now that he has forced his radical spending on your Finance Minister, Minister Freeland, and that he has forced her to break the $40 billion deficit. And in fact, we just found out today, just today, that he is begging Mark Carney, Carbon Tax Carney, Conflict of Interest Carney, to serve as the next Finance Minister of Canada. So your Prime Minister, who actually has overseen all of this procurement, all of this fraud under CEBA, under ArriveScan, I have some sympathy for you, that he is now going to oust the first female finance minister in Canadian history. Do you think that's right?
Well,
I apologize,
focus.
Minister. That is our time, but perhaps you can respond in Mr. Sousa's 5 minutes.